Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. We got a new video today. It's a long time coming. We're going to talk about the Odin 2 portal. Now, a couple months ago, I got my hands on an early prototype unit, and I did a couple videos about it. In fact, I did a pretty in-depth impressions video and then also a pretty in-depth performance video as well. And so in this video, we're going to do a quick recap of all the things that we learned in those first two videos, and then go from there and talk about all the things that are now finalized with the Odin 2 portal and what this actually means when we put it all together. And long story short, if you're looking for a premium Android-based handheld, this might be the one to get. It's got a 7-inch beautiful OLED screen and really no big deal breakers either. However, at a starting price of $330, there's a lot to discuss. And so grab your favorite snack and drink and let's go ahead and get started. Okay, as we jump in, I want to go over the specs really quickly. Like with the previous Odin 2 and Odin 2 Mini, this one has the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 as its CPU. And this is still one of the best Android chips that you can find on the market. It's no longer bleeding edge, but basically anything you can throw at it in terms of Android will work on this handheld. Now, the amount of RAM and storage that you get on this device will depend on the pricing tier that you pick up. The base model will give you 8 gigs of RAM and 128 gigs of storage. What they call the Pro model will be 12 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage. That's what we're reviewing here today. And then finally, if you want to go to the full Monty, they have the Max model, 16 gigabytes of RAM as well as 1 terabyte of internal storage. One of the big things that separates this Odin 2 portal from the previous Odin 2 devices is its display. It's got a 7-inch 1080p OLED panel with a refresh rate of 120 Hz, and it's gorgeous. We'll talk about this a lot in this video. And the battery size here is the same as the original Odin 2, 8,000 milliamp hours. That will give you an average of about 8 hours of battery life depending on what you're playing. And in terms of weight, we're looking at 438 grams with my review unit. That makes it exactly 4 grams heavier than my Switch OLED. As far as connectivity, we've got the works. We've got Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.3, as well as DisplayPort video out. And given this is an Android device, it is also running Android 13 with a special build made by the company AYN. Now, in terms of pricing, we've got those same 3 tiers that we talked about before, Base, Pro, and Max. And as of making this video, we still are under their pre-order pricing, although orders have shifted from Indiegogo to their actual website. So for the base model, we're looking at $330 before shipping and taxes. Now, one thing worth noting is that AYN always limits the base model of any of their devices to only one specific color, and most of the time it's just going to be the black color. And it's the same case here, so the base model of the Odin 2 portal will only come in black. If you want the other colors like white or indigo, you'll have to pay for the Pro or Max tier. And I've never been a big fan of this because I feel like the base model will be fine for most people, and so I don't like the fact that if you want a white or indigo device, you're going to have to pay more, and the Pro model is actually $400, so there's a $70 premium just to get that new color, and of course the new RAM and storage. And so there is quite a big jump from the base to the Pro model. Even though you are getting 12 gigs of RAM and 512 gigs of storage, $70 is pretty steep. Same thing with that Max model. That's going to be an additional $100, so up to $500 for the Max model just to get 16 gigs of RAM and a terabyte of storage. And I think when it comes down to bang for buck, $330 makes a lot more sense to me with the base model, but you will be limited with that black color. And as we'll discuss later in the video, I'm not really sure the black model is the one to get because it is quite smudgy. So now that we've talked about the specs and the pricing, let's go into a quick recap of all the things that we learned over the previous 2 videos that I made about the Odin 2 portal. And of course, if you want to go more in depth with each of these details, I'll leave those other videos linked down below. Let's start by talking about its size because it is a bigger handheld. It's got a 7-inch screen, so it does make it quite a bit bigger than the original Odin 2, which only had a 6-inch screen. It also very much so dwarfs the Odin 2 Mini, which had a 5-inch screen. You can see that it's just a night and day difference between the two. And bear in mind that all these Odin 2 models, including the Mini, have the exact same chipset inside, so the performance will be just about the same between any of them. And so the big advantage here is going to be that larger screen, and this one is also OLED unlike the other two. Now, if you're trying to wrap your head around the size of the Odin 2 portal, I have found that the best analogy is actually the Switch OLED. These have the exact same screen size, they're both OLED, and they also are about the same weight and overall size. So the way I like to put it is that if you know exactly when and where you're going to play with your Switch in handheld mode, it's probably going to be a very similar experience with the Odin 2 portal. Now, one unique aspect of the Odin 2 Portal is that it has an all-glass front display. You can see that my light is just reflecting on the sides here, and then it goes all the way across the screen like this. And the glass here is really nice and premium feeling. It is curved on the edge, so you can see there's a little bit of curve right here as it goes forward. And this actually feels really good in the hands. It has a really nice premium feel right here on the front. But of course, bear in mind that because it is a glass front right here, and you obviously will be putting your hands all over it, it is going to get quite fingerprinty and smudgy here on the front. And also keep in mind that because we have so much glass here, it is a very glossy and reflective experience. Now, I've only tested the indigo and black models, but it is definitely more prominent on the black one than the indigo one. And so if you are looking to minimize the overall distractions that come when using a really reflective panel like this, then you might want to consider the white model instead. But overall, I would say I do like the glass experience here just because it lends such a premium feel to the device itself. Now, another finding from my previous videos about the Odin 2 Portal is that it has somewhat flat ergonomics. The device definitely does have ergonomic bumps on the back, but they are quite shallow, especially compared to the original Odin 2. It definitely feels less flat than the Switch OLED, and I think that most people will think it's just fine, but for me personally, I would really like it to be just a little bit more prominent. Now, in terms of just general ergonomics and being able to reach the controls and have a comfortable time playing it, I think it is a very good handheld. When playing D-pad-centric games, I find it to be very comfortable. There's no additional stretching that's required in order to reach the controls. And part of this has to do with the V-shaped pattern that they made for the controls, which is always excellent in terms of ergonomics. So it's easier to reach the D-pad and the right analog stick without the other ones getting in the way. And it's also very comfortable when playing analog-centric games. You know, think about things like Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, PS2. All that stuff is very comfortable to play. It's probably ideal on this handheld. Really, the only time I found myself wanting was when playing dual-stick analog games. You know, things like more modern games through game streaming, or maybe things like Nintendo Switch emulation. In particular, first-person shooter games really rub me the wrong way, to the point where I would probably just rather play games like this on something like the Steam Deck. And it is a bit of a shame that the Odin 2 Portal is so flat, because I feel like if they just made it as thick as the original Odin 2, it would have been a more enhanced experience. Now, thankfully, it's not the end of the world when it comes to these flat ergonomics, because there are several different ways that they can be enhanced on their own. For example, AYN is now offering what they are calling a TPU grip case. And this essentially will both protect your device and also enhance the size of the grips on the back. Now, this has not been released yet, but as soon as I can get my hands on one, I will try to showcase it in a video. And they are selling it for $15 on the website, which I think is a reasonable upgrade price. In addition, I fully expect that 3D printed grips and other things like that will start popping up on websites like Etsy. And so it's not the end of the world for me, it's just something that out of the box I think could be a little bit better. Another out-of-box experience that I think could be better are their analog sticks, which are quite small. Now, these are Hall sensor sticks and they have a great range of motion and feel very precise. So it's not the mechanism itself that I have issues with, but rather just the fact that the sticks themselves are relatively shallow and small in diameter. And it is exacerbated on a larger device like the Odin 2 Portal. Now, thankfully, this is another thing that AYN has been addressing. They are now offering something that they call a textured joystick cap. And they did send me a pair of these with this review unit to be able to check out. And these are a night and day difference between the original sticks. They are taller, they are wider, and also have a better texture. And for anybody who pre-ordered the device over Indiegogo, they will already get these sticks included in their package. And so I think that's a win right there, and they're also only charging an additional $5 for these caps. They're already up for sale in the accessories section of their website, so if you do pick one of these devices up from their website, I would highly encourage grabbing this for another $5. It's also going to come with a new set of ABXY buttons in case you want to swap them out for the Nintendo Switch style pattern. Personally, I like having an Xbox style like this just because most Android-based games are going to require these controls anyway. However, one thing of note, these joystick caps only come in the black color, so if you pick up the white or the indigo models, you will have a color mismatch. This may be another one of those things where Etsy solutions might come in handy. So in a nutshell, I think that out of the box, these sticks are a little bit too small, but having the additional joystick caps are really great. In fact, as soon as I put them on my device, I never took them off again. Okay, moving along with our recap, another thing I wanted to talk about is the audio quality of this device, and it is very good. Let's do a quick test here at about 75% volume with Horizon Chase. And so overall, I think that the audio quality here is very good. It's got a nice, rich presence, and you can hear the low, mids, and highs very distinctly. Another thing worth noting in terms of overall sound is that the fan profile here is very quiet. Even when I push it up to max fan speed, which is probably not something you would ever need to do with this chipset, it is still pleasantly quiet. I think the best way I can summarize it is that this fan is something that you hardly will ever notice as you're playing it, no matter what you're playing. And then finally, the last part of our recap here is that this screen is still amazingly good like it was with the preview model. It's got super rich and vibrant colors and also gets super bright but then also super dim. So it's ideal in just about any environment that you can think of. And there's going to be an entire section about this screen later in the video because there's a lot to talk about here. So that's a quick recap of all the things that we established in my preview videos, and all of those things remain the same. Now let's talk about some of the things that are new, or at least confirmed now with this review unit. And I think the first thing worth noting is that the final plastics on this model, which are different than what I had with my preview model, are quite smudgy. You can see that there's some sort of film or coating that's on the plastic, and it really picks up your smudging, especially with a black model. And this has been the same with basically all of the other AYN products, so I'm not surprised to see this here, but it is a little bit disappointing. In fact, the smudging here is so bad that I personally ordered an indigo model, and I think I'm actually going to email AYN and ask them to change it to the white model instead. There are some advantages to having a black device, we will talk about that later, but smudging is definitely not one of them, so I'm not a huge fan of these plastics. And the texture of the plastic itself is relatively smooth and a little bit silky. I think it feels pretty good and definitely a little bit premium, but I personally would like something a little bit more bumpy and textured and maybe more matte. So in summary, if you don't like smudging on your devices like me, then the black model is definitely not the one for you. Another thing we can go into more detail about now that we have a final review unit are the controls, because previously these were still a work in progress. We've already talked about the analog sticks, and like I mentioned, they have a nice range of motion, especially when you add these joystick caps. So let's talk about the D-pad and the face buttons. The D-pad is very typical of AYN products. They've always used a PS Vita style D-pad, and this one is no different. It has a soft clickiness to it and is super accurate. You basically can feel any time that you move in any direction. Personally, I think this is one of the best dome switch D-pads that you can find on the market. It's very similar to other devices like the Retroid Pocket 5. When it comes to more precision-based games like Contra, you can feel all the nuances of the D-pad as you move it around, and so I would not expect to get any false diagonals with a D-pad like this. And also, because you can feel all those little clicks as you move it around, it also works really well with Street Fighter style games. After a little bit of adjustment, I bet you'll be able to do all the quarter circles and half circles that you can dream of. It's a really easy experience. Now the face buttons are of a different quality. These are rubber membranes, which means that they have a bit of travel to them and are a little bit clicky. The rubber membranes here are quite stiff, and so it does take some force to be able to press it down, and it also makes the buttons a little bit clacky. And so they are a bit on the loud side. You can hear as I'm pressing them down that there is quite a bit of noise going on. It's very similar to the Retroid Pocket Mini as well as the Retroid Pocket 5. So I would say among the Odin 2, the Odin 2 Mini, and the Portal, these are definitely the loudest buttons of the bunch. But I would say overall volume aside, these are actually pretty good buttons. They feel really satisfying to press down on. They're not too hard or anything. Another element that's now finalized are the shoulder and trigger buttons. These now have a textured material to them, as you can see here, and I really like this type of texture. It makes them a little bit grippy, which is always something that I appreciate when it comes to shoulders and triggers. Now the shoulder buttons are nice and easy to press down on, so no complaints here, and then the triggers themselves also are analog and they have a wide range of motion as well. I feel like they're a little bit more wide than I would like. They kind of feel like wedges, but thankfully it's really easy to be able to press them from basically any angle. So overall, I would say these are probably not my favorite triggers in the world, but they definitely get the job done. Now, another thing that's finalized with this Odin review unit is the overall software. And like I mentioned, this is a special build of Android that AYN has made. And it is very similar to basically anything they've made before. So you can go into the settings here, and then in the bottom, you have your Odin settings. So you'll be able to go and adjust some of the parameters here. For example, I found that the rumble motor is a little bit too strong, so I put it down on low, but you can go quite a bit stronger if you would like. But for the most part, you will probably just be using the top-down menu to adjust the parameters within Android. This is where you can do things like adjust the performance profile, and you can also adjust the refresh rate from 120 Hz to 60, and you can also adjust your fan profile here as well. This is also where you would adjust your ABXY pattern in the software. You can also adjust whether or not your trigger is going to be analog or digital, and you can adjust the LED lights around the joystick. So you can see here I have it as blue and then about 60% brightness. Another thing worth mentioning is that they have what they call a floating icon. This will be turned on by default. And what this means is when you start up a game, on the right side you'll see this little white line. If you swipe over, you will then get this menu. And there's a lot you can do here. You can adjust your brightness, you can monitor your performance metrics, you can also use what they call a key adapter, which is going to be your key mapper. So if you're using touchscreen controls, you can adjust them to work with the controls that are built in the machine. In addition, you can set up some of your other profiles on a per game basis. So this is showing that it's Horizon Chase. So I can go in here and say, you know what, I only need normal mode for this game, and then it's only going to play that every time I start up this game. Or I can just use follow global, which means that no matter what I have set for the entire machine, it's going to follow that. And so this would be great with certain emulators where you want to have maybe a higher performance mode without having to toggle it every time. It's just going to remember it for you. And you can also do the same with your gamepad settings. So it's nice that you have a little bit of control when it comes to how to configure everything without having to do it manually every time. So in general, this is one of my favorite Android builds on any handheld, just because it kind of gets out of your way, unless you really want to change something, which you can do here, or of course you can set them up as per game profiles as well. Another thing that's now been finalized with the software is the video out capabilities. And the video out works via their USB-C port, so you can use a dock like one that they sell on their website, or even just any HDMI adapter. And you've got a lot of different options to choose from, 4K, 1440p at different refresh rates, or you can do 1080p as well. And so it's nice that we have a lot to work with when it comes to video out. And because the device display is already 16:9, that means that everything is going to basically translate over to your 16:9 screen if that's what you're using. And so this will be super handy when it comes to showing things like 4:3 content. You won't have to readjust the settings. And then finally, the other thing that's worth confirming with this review unit is that performance is exactly what I was expecting with this Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. And it falls exactly in line with the Odin 2 as well as the Odin 2 Mini. This means that as long as there's an emulator within Android, you will be able to play basically any single game at full speed. And because we've got a 1080p resolution screen, with these 3D-based systems, you will be able to upscale the resolution to match the display. This includes a 4x resolution upscale with things like PSP as well as Nintendo 3DS. And for systems like GameCube and PS2, you'll be able to play the vast majority of them at a 3x resolution. At this point, most of your limitations are only going to come from the emulator itself and compatibility versus the raw power of the chipset. And when you combine this with the gorgeous screen, it becomes a really excellent emulation experience. Now, there are still some emulators that will run into some problems, but it's mostly software related. For example, Cemu is now in a beta release, which means that you can do Wii U emulation on this platform. However, bear in mind that because it's still in beta and a work in progress, the performance and compatibility is still kind of hit or miss. Most of the lightweight games are going to play just fine, and some of the heavyweight ones as well. I am going to pixelate some of these games just to kind of keep it safe from copyright issues, but you can see that with some of these, yes, they are playing at full speed. For the kart racing game, it's not quite at a solid 60, but once you kind of get through the first lap, it usually will kind of even itself out somewhere between like 58 and 60, so it's still a very good experience. However, of note, with the latest release of this Cemu emulator, one game in particular is not working really well. Anytime you try to do an autosave or manual save, it'll freeze the game, and so this is one that I haven't been able to progress with. And again, I think this is a software-related issue, but you can see that it is getting pretty close to 30 frames per second. Now, another emulated system that is relatively limited is Nintendo Switch. As you may know, almost a year ago, the official Yuzu emulator app for Android was taken down. And so really at this point, we are left with that emulator from a year ago or some of the forks that have cropped up since then. And so when it comes to Nintendo Switch emulation, it's no surprise here that many games will play well, but there will be others that don't. And my general take on it is that you probably shouldn't buy any Android handheld just to play Nintendo Switch emulation, but rather think of it as an added bonus. Because there are quite a few games that run really well, it's just going to be a matter of whether or not that's important enough for you to actually try out. Another thing worth talking about when it comes to performance is win later. I talked about this a lot in my performance video for the Odin 2 Portal a couple months back. And long story short, there are quite a few PC games that you'll be able to play through this app. But bear in mind that this is also still a work in progress. So again, not something I would recommend buying an Odin 2 Portal for, but it is pretty awesome to get certain PC games running. Now, the other piece of the puzzle, besides emulation as well as playing Windows games, are going to be Android games, and all of these are going to play great. When it comes down to it, this is an ideal device for Android gaming. It's got a 16:9 aspect ratio, 1080p resolution, and enough power to play all of these games. So for the most part, usually what I will do is just download the game, go into the settings, and turn it up to the highest settings that I can. And for the vast majority of the time, everything is going to run really smoothly. So this definitely has enough juice to be able to play all of your favorite Android games. And then finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about in this section, where we're talking about new as well as confirming some of the things with its review unit, is battery life. And as expected, battery life is amazing on this device. You can get upwards of 16 hours of battery when playing something lightweight, like Game Boy or game streaming. It's crazy. And when playing games like PS2 and GameCube, you can still expect really good performance. If you're playing a really hard to emulate game, I would expect maybe 5 hours of gameplay. But if you're playing something lightweight, then you can expect upwards of 12 hours of battery life. The other day, I played Final Fantasy X for an hour, and in that hour time period, I lost 8% battery. And if you do the math, that means 12.5 hours of battery life if we were to do that for the entire time. Now, when you really push it, like with Win Later, I would expect about 2.5 hours of battery life. So that's your worst case scenario if you're going to be pushing it to the max the entire time. And I still think that is pretty decent when it comes to a sit-down gaming session. Also of note, standby time is really good. I was able to put the device to sleep and come back 12 hours later, and it only lost 3% battery. So when you put this all together, now that we have a final review unit, there are a couple things I could nitpick about, but for the most part, everything is passing with flying colors. So now I want to talk about the overall screen experience of the Odin 2 Portal, because there are many things that are amazing about it, and one thing that might give you pause. The first thing worth discussing is the 120Hz refresh rate available on this screen. And this is excellent for many reasons, one of them being the fact that just navigating through the menus feels ultra smooth like it is on a modern phone. And there are also plenty of Android games that will play at a higher refresh rate, and so that's going to be excellent as well. In addition, a 120Hz screen will reduce input latency. I did some testing on this in my previous videos, and I found that yes, this has some of the best input latency when it comes to an Android handheld. But for me personally, one of my favorite aspects of a 120Hz screen is the fact that we can use black frame insertion within RetroArch. In my previous video, I had to do a manual configuration of the settings, but since then, in the nightly version of RetroArch, it's actually available within the synchronization section right here. So all you have to do now is just go into Video, Synchronization, and then go into Black Frame Insertion, set it to 1. The other thing I would recommend doing is going into Output, and then under the vertical refresh rate, manually configure this to 120 Hz. After that, it should work pretty well. If you get any sort of flickering, what I would recommend is going through here and toggling on and off the 60-120 Hz. I found that if you toggle this once or twice and you're getting flickering, it'll usually go away. Now, I talked about black frame insertion quite in depth in my last video. I even showed off examples of what it's going to look like. And the way this works is that in between each of your frames, it's going to insert a black frame. And the benefit of this is it'll reduce motion blur, especially when it comes to those older pixel games. And so many of these games will have a CRT-like quality to them. It's something that you have to see to really understand. Unfortunately, I'm not able to convey it in a video like this, but if you enjoy playing on a CRT, this is going to be right up your alley. Of note, this will make your screen darker, which means you'll have to increase the brightness, which can reduce the battery life as well. So there is a bit of a trade-off when it comes to brightness, but other than that, everything works well. And I've also found that it's been vastly improved since my previous testing a couple months ago. In that previous video, I only had certain cores that I would reliably use, but now I found that every single core works great with this screen. So basically anything that you can play in RetroArch, you can also play with BFI on. Not only that, you'll be able to use things like shaders and overlays as well, in addition to BFI, and so you can really tailor your experience. In fact, when it comes to retro gaming, this might be one of the best screen experiences I've ever seen. Not only do we have an OLED display which makes everything nice and vibrant, but then we also have the ability to use BFI and a combination of shaders and overlays. And so from a purely visual standpoint, this has definitely blown my socks off. It's been a wonderful experience with just about anything within RetroArch. Another thing that's nice about this screen is the fact that we have a lack of physical bezels. Because we have an all-glass display, and especially on this black model, the black bezels on the left and right just kind of fade into the rest of the shell. So when you play 4x3 content games like you're seeing here on the screen, the bezels on the left and right just don't seem as prominent as they would on a lighter device. And so this is what I meant earlier when I talked about the bad plastics on the black model. That yes, they are kind of annoying, but then there's also good qualities of having a black device like this. It'll really come down to what you prefer over the other. If you don't mind smudging, then I think that a black model and having these invisible bezels on the left and right is a really neat experience. But for my part, these smudges bother me enough that I'm definitely not going to be using the black model as my primary handheld when it comes to the Odin 2 Portal. Now, another thing I like to do on this screen is game streaming. Let's talk about this. To start, when it comes to console streaming, PS5 and Xbox, I found no issues when it came to my local network. This device has Wi-Fi 7 and I recently upgraded to Wi-Fi 6E in my home network, and so yes, I've been able to play all these systems no problem. But I have found that where it really shines is with PC game streaming, because we got a lot of other things we can work with. Over the past month or so, I've been testing out an app called Apollo. And this is a fork of Moonlight or Sunshine that essentially creates a virtual desktop environment every time you start it up. What this means is you don't have to depend on your host PC and whether or not it's hooked up to HDR or has a high refresh rate. Instead, every time that you connect, it's going to make a 120Hz 1080p display that you will then connect to. In addition, if you play any games that support HDR, it'll pick up on that as well, and so you will be able to turn on HDR with games that have it. Now, the list of PC games that actually support HDR are kind of few and far between, so I would recommend looking at a list before you try to invest in this device. But it is pretty neat to be able to use HDR on a device like this, and again, you'll be able to use 120Hz and 1080p. One of my favorite examples is Destiny 2, because if you use that Apollo app, it will pick up on that virtual environment and enable HDR. And the HDR in this game is somewhat subtle, but I think it just looks really good. Everything pops a little bit, and so I've really enjoyed playing Destiny 2 on this device. The only thing really holding me back from making this like my primary Destiny 2 handheld is those ergonomics. Long story short, if you are interested in streaming, I found this screen to be one of the best experiences all around. Now, I have heard that some people have had connection issues when it comes to PS5 streaming. I haven't actually observed that myself, but it is something that I wanted to make note of in case that's your primary way of streaming, that some people have been having issues. Another thing that was reported to me is that when you reduce the brightness on this display, you will get a little bit of a green tinting at about 30% brightness and lower. And it was one of those things that I really didn't notice until someone specifically pointed it out with gray colors in particular. So if you look at this footage here where I'm kind of moving it back and forth, you can see that around 30% brightness, it gets a little bit of a green tinge to it. Again, this is something that I had to test multiple times with different screens to actually notice it. Now, I'm not really sure what's going on here. This may be an effect of the panel itself or maybe some sort of software configuration. I did go into the Android settings and tried to change things out, but nothing seemed to fix it. And to be clear, this is not an issue exclusive to the Odin 2 Portal. I just got the new Pocket Evo in the mail from Ioneo, so I'm going to be working on a review for this, but I did have time to test this screen as well. And this one has the same issue that if you reduce the brightness down to about 30%, you will see it kind of flip over to something that has a little bit of a green tint to it. And again, it is very subtle and you may not actually see it here on your screen, but it is something that I can see with my naked eye. It actually led me on a bit of a journey to see if I could replicate this experience with other OLED displays. And sure enough, on my Nintendo Switch OLED, I was able to get a very similar experience. It's a little bit more subtle, but yes, I can get a little bit of a green tint when I reduce the brightness. Meanwhile, on other OLED displays, like on the Retroid Pocket 5 as well as the Steam Deck OLED, I don't see this experience at all. And so this is something that's not happening with every single display, but it is happening with about half of the displays that I have. For me personally, I don't find it to be a deal breaker. I had to hunt it down in order to notice it. And so for me, in just my regular gameplay experience, it's not something that bothers me. However, if you are particular about your color balance, you want to make sure that you're not getting this green tint, then you may want to hold off on buying this device and wait to see if they have a software update. But like I said, for my part, it's not something that really moved the needle for me in any way. Alright, so now that we've done a recap of all the things we already knew about the Odin 2 Portal and all the things that we've now learned, let's start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the Odin 2 Portal. Let's start with what I like, and number one has to be this screen. This is an amazing experience. I love the fact that it's 7 inches and OLED and also 120 Hz and HDR capable. There are so many things that you can do with this screen that you can't do with other handhelds. I also love the tried and true performance of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. Basically everything that you can run on Android is going to run great here. I also think it's going to be an excellent streaming handheld, mostly because of that screen, but then also the fact that game streaming just doesn't require a lot of battery. And with an 8,000 milliamp hour battery, that means you're going to be able to play for hours and hours on end. Now, when it comes to controls, I think they are decent. I have some nitpicks when it comes to things like the size of the sticks and the clackiness of the buttons, but I think just overall, it is an excellent experience. And I couldn't be happier with the battery life. I think that in a mixed use case scenario, like playing the high-end and low-end stuff, you should expect about an 8 hours average battery life. And I think it's also worth noting that the Android build that AYN creates is really good. It just kind of gets out of your way and lets you focus on the gaming. However, there are some things that I wish were a little bit better with the Odin 2 Portal. Number one has to do with those flat ergonomics. And at this point, I've had the Odin 2 Portal for about a month between the previous build that I had as well as this new review unit. And I found that really the only time that I find myself thinking that, man, I wish I was playing on something else is when playing a first-person shooter game. For me, I like to have really big grips for that, and this one just doesn't have that. So I am hoping that their new grip case as well as maybe 3D printed options will solve that one issue for me. And then after that, I probably won't have any issues when it comes to the ergonomics. But out of the box, I would say that it is less than ideal. Same thing with the face buttons. I found them to be just a little bit clackier and louder than I would like. Now, it's not to the point where I would say it's a problem, but it is definitely something that I wish was better. I'm hoping that over time, the rubber membranes may soften to make it not so loud of an experience. And then finally, it is worth noting that this device commands a premium price tag, and it's not going to be a good fit for everyone. It starts at a $330 price point, but you have to remember that that only comes with the black color. So if you want the other color options, you're looking at $400 plus shipping. And that price point is a very serious investment, to the point where it's actually toe-to-toe with the Steam Deck. And I think that once we get into this price category, it is worth exploring whether or not this device in general, and this platform that it runs on, is worth your time and money. When it comes down to it, I think the Odin 2 Portal is one of the best Android-based devices that has ever been made. It's a perfect storm of both amazing screen and performance to back it up, and you don't see this very often. So depending on what you're trying to do, Android gaming, emulation that's available on Android, as well as game streaming, then yes, this is a very good fit. It really comes down to whether or not an ARM-based handheld like the Odin 2 Portal is a good fit for your gaming needs. Compared to something like an x86 handheld PC, there are some advantages of the Odin 2 Portal. It's going to be smaller and lighter with better battery life, and if those three components are important to you, then yes, the Odin 2 Portal is a good alternative to those handheld PCs. But that does mean you'll have to live with the limitations of Android as a platform. And compared to something like a Steam Deck, it does mean that there will be fewer games that you can actually play. For example, there are more systems you can emulate on a Steam Deck compared to an Android-based device, and it also can play PC games, and there are thousands of options there. So when it comes to playing the most games possible, the Steam Deck is still going to win every time. It really comes down to those other components, being lighter and smaller and also better battery life. If those are important to you and you don't mind the limitations of Android, then the Odin 2 Portal is pretty easy to recommend. So in a nutshell, if you are looking for the highest tier Android device that you can find, I think the Odin 2 Portal is an excellent example. There are other devices that are worth exploring as well, including that Neo Pocket Evo that I mentioned earlier, and I will do a full comparison between the two after I've done my Evo review. But as it stands, if you are looking for confirmation that the Odin 2 Portal is an excellent handheld, I am here to say that yes, it's pretty amazing. In all the time that I've spent testing both the prototype and the review unit, I've never found any deal breakers for this device. Sure, there are some nitpicks, but overall, I think it's a net positive experience. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. Are you thinking about picking up the Odin 2 Portal, or is this a little bit too rich for your blood? As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.